Our moderator is Ian Masters, who will introduce the speakers. Ian's a BBC-trained broadcast journalist who's covered national security affairs for over 25 years on public radio. He's the host of Background Briefing and Live from the Left Coast on KPFK. That airs on Sundays from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Ian has been a senior fellow at UCLA's Center for Strategic and International Affairs and the UCLA Center for International Relations. And he was a consultant to the Center for National Security Studies at Los Alamos Laboratories in New Mexico. So please join me in welcoming Ian Masters.
Thank you, Claudia, and thank you all for coming. Recent reports in the Washington Post raised the alarm about the extent and effectiveness of the protection President Obama gets from the Secret Service, with much of the criticism coming from big donors to the campaign who attended the A-list inauguration events and found the security around our new president alarmingly porous. This is not to say the Secret Service are not doing their job and have it covered, but after a bitter, polarized election with so much residual anger on the losing side, galvanized by Sarah Palin's negative campaigning that portrayed Barack Obama as an enabler of child molesters and a pal of terrorists, we have to be concerned about the alienation of racists, reactionaries, know-nothings, and nativists who are not ready for a post-racial America, to put it mildly. In addition, we should be concerned that the deterioration of our fragile economic condition is likely to cause social stress and fuel the dark side of our divided nation that has always had a malignant strain of hatred and ignorance in its political DNA. Maybe a cornpone Nazi with Bible in hand arises from the firmament, and as the book of Revelation prophesies, we behold a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him. On a cheerier note, the playwright Bertolt Brecht, who escaped from the Nazi death squads and settled for a while in Santa Monica Canyon, wrote a satirical play about Adolf Hitler called The Resistible Rise of Arturo Ui, in which he reduces the tyrant who was responsible for the deaths of up to 50 million people to who he really was, a very small and insignificant man. Brecht's Hitler is a small-time gangster trying to muscle in on the cauliflower concession as a protection racketeer in the Chicago produce market. Brecht's point being that we elevate the Hitlers and Stalins as historical figures, but do not judge them for who they really were: a failed painter who hung out with lowlifes and a mugger who graduated to a bank robber. How they got to who they were, how they got from who they were to what they did, is a subject worth exploring. And the last line in Brecht's play is a somewhat indelicate warning to us all. The bitch that bore Hitler is still in heat. Tonight we will begin with Mark Potok, who will speak for 15 minutes or so, followed by Chris Hedges. Then we will have a discussion and then open up to you for our extensive Q&A. One of the most highly regarded monitors of the extreme right in the world today, Mark Potok is director of the Southern Poverty Law Center's Intelligence Project and editor of its award-winning quarterly journal, Intelligence Report. His blog, hatewatch.org, is a resource for law enforcement and civil rights lawyers and activists. Key spokesman for the civil rights organization based in Alabama who effectively put the Ku Klux Klan out of business, Mark has testified before the Senate and the United Nations High Commission on Human Rights. Ladies and gentlemen, Mark Potok.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Ian. for the introduction. I'm going to try and race through a few things as fast as I can and hopefully stay within my 15 minutes. And I thought I'd start by talking a little bit about kind of how we got here in terms of the radical right in the longest, going right back to the beginning. And I thought I might try and touch a couple of times on Christian right issues, which are really Chris Hedges' specialty. Very briefly, let me say that the radical right has been with us essentially from the beginning. It was Benjamin Franklin way back at the start who used to talk about the Germans, who amusingly enough now are the core population of whites in this country as stupid people who are incapable of coming to this country and learning English and so on. We've had through our history just a series of these kind of backlash movements. We had, of course, the Know-Nothings in the 1840s and 1850s that Ian referred to, the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. We had the 20s Klan, the so-called Second-Era Klan, which was all about immigration, and in particular Catholic and to a lesser extent Jewish immigration. We had in the 20s and 30s, what I think of really as proto-fascists, people like the so-called radio priest Charles Coughlin, who used to rant to some 3 million, 4 million people over CBS radio about the Jews and what they were doing to this country. Henry Ford was in that camp as well. I'm sure people here probably know that Henry Ford published, among other things, The International Jew, which basically incorporated the protocols of the Elders of Zion into a massive international conspiracy. After the war, of course, the war was a turning point in the sense that, after the war, it got a lot harder. Let me say right before the war that the Americans were very involved, much more than the Germans, in the practice and codification of eugenics, of the idea of breeding a better human race, so that many states in this country, long before the Germans got into this idea, passed laws mandating the sterilization of certain people and so on. That all more or less came to an end for a brief respite after the Second World War, as people kind of realized what were the ultimate consequences of these kind of belief systems, the idea of building a better human race, the idea of, a certain group of people being evil personified, and so on. That did not last long. George Lincoln Rockwell formed something called the American Nazi Party, which was really the first major post-war fascist grouping in this country. And let me say very briefly that Rockwell did some important things with the American Nazi Party. He expanded the idea of what it was to be white in such a way that it would incorporate, for instance, Slavs and Southern Europeans, people who had been excluded by Hitler, but this was very much a part of appealing to the American consciousness. He also married up essentially atheistic National Socialist ideology with a kind of a heretical version of the Bible called Christian Identity, which we might discuss a little later on in the evening. When the Klan, the so-called Third-Era Klan, appeared during the Civil Rights Movement after the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision, that was really the beginning, I think, of a sea change in the sense that, the Klan violence during the Civil Rights era, I think it quite clearly made possible the passage of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act and then the Voting Rights Act, which are, the centerpiece of the Civil Rights Revolution. So, that was the beginning of the Klan and the radical right in general being separated from power in the sense that, of course, up to that point, the Klan had literally thousands of members who were police officers in southern police departments and so on. We saw every decade or so, it seems like we get, one of these big resurgences. In the 1980s, it was very largely a group called the Posse Comitatus in the Midwest, which basically thrived amongst farmers out there who were losing their farms for a number of reasons, not related to what the Posse thought it was, which was essentially satanic Jews and international bankers out to do in Christian white people. And of course, after the Posse essentially died off, we had the huge militia movement of the 1990s, the mid-90s, to more or less the end of the millennium. And, maybe we'll talk about this later in the evening, but, it's the militia movement where you really begin to see some very heavy cross-pollination between the kind of Christian right and the militia world. Very often, militia people call themselves and think of themselves as Christian patriots. I want to talk just a bit about some of the very major trends, really, of the last 40 years, having given that 3 minutes, skip through the 20th century and beyond. I think that since two things, since the Civil Rights Movement and the 1964 Immigration Act, which abolished the national origin system and really began the kind of wave of immigration that we're still seeing now, those are kind of critical moments that shaped the radical right in this country. Fundamentally what that began was a kind of new ideology on the part of the radical right, which centered around the idea of the dispossession of white people. It was no longer that we've got to get back to the good old days where sort of men were men and women were women and black people knew their place. It was this new idea of we've been robbed, we are being dispossessed. That, of course, coincided, as I said a little bit earlier, with the loss of any kind, well, not any kind, but of a substantial connection to genuine political power. What has happened over that period, over the last 30 or 40 years, is that we've seen, I think just a complete sea change in the ideology of the radical right, in the sense that the radical right in the past was fundamentally, I think, restorationist. In other words, they viewed themselves as having lost something that they needed to get back to. We needed to get back to, as I said, when sort of black people knew their place and gay people stayed in the closet and women kept their mouths shut and so on. So it was very much this old idea of we've got to return to the Garden of Eden, to the golden age when America was really what America is supposed to be. What that meant, what they have turned into, is a completely revolutionary movement, which is really quite different than what they were before. Today, and this is probably true of the last 30 plus years, it's gotten more and more extreme over time. The idea is that this country has absolutely nothing to recommend it. It has been, it's been robbed by people not like us. The core of it is rotten. There is absolutely nothing worth saving. And in fact, we have to build a revolutionary movement. And there's a big difference, too, in what the goal is. As white supremacists say these days, or as white nationalists say these days, I'll mow my own lawn, thank you very much. In other words, their idea is that we need to create an all-white country, not a country in which white people rule over others. So, they say, and they are right in saying this, that we are not white supremacists precisely, we're white separatists. And this came, this manifested itself in a number of different ways. But one of the most famous ones is a lot of the kind of Aryan groups out there, the neo-Nazi groups and so on, came up with the idea of the so-called Northwest Imperative. Let's all move up to the Pacific Northwest. That's where there's still good white Christian people and only a very, very, very few minorities, and that's where we will build our country. And some of them kind of go on to elaborate to say, South Florida will become a Cuban country, New York will become a Jewish country, and on and on. Southern California, of course, will become Mexican or something like that. Just to give you a sense of, how revolutionary really are they when I say that, I will never forget that when those planes flew into the World Trade Center on September 1st of 2001, a man named Billy Roper, before the buildings had collapsed, in fact, sent out an email to all 1,400 members of the National Alliance, which was then the leading neo-Nazi group in America. And he said, this is from memory, but almost word for word, he said, "The enemy of our enemy is our friend." We should applaud what he actually said. Anyone who drives an airplane into a building to kill Jews is all right with me. I only wish that our members had half as much testicular fortitude. coincident with that kind of attitude, I mean, this really began in the mid-90s. You saw it in the militia movement. Everybody in the room, of course, knows about the Oklahoma City bombing. There were sort of 168 people, including 19 children, killed in half a minute. But what people probably don't know is that, over the course of the 90s and more or less up to the present, we've seen more and more and more of these extraordinary domestic terror plots. The reason that people don't know most of them is because almost none of them were successful outside of Oklahoma City. But just to give you a single example, in 1998 there was a small Klan group in Texas in Wise County, up northwest of Fort Worth. They decided that they needed to blow up a particular natural gas refinery. The idea was they would blow this up. This would bring all the police and fire department people and ambulances and so on, all emergency workers, to one side of the county. They would go to the other side of the county and rob banks with which they would fund the Aryan Revolution. In fact, the natural gas refinery was right next to an elementary school, and there's an amazing FBI tape of the Klansman, actually Klansman and his wife in a pickup truck talking back and forth about the school, concluding with her saying, "Well, honey, what has to be, has to be." Then you hear the shouts of FBI, and she screams, and the tape goes black. When that plot was broken up, in fact, the federal authorities said that had they succeeded, had they in fact blown up this natural gas refinery, they would have killed 10 to 30,000 people. That's 10 times the number. I don't need to remind you of the people who died, in fact, on 9/11. I'll say just very briefly about the Christian right, which is much less my specialty, that, at the same time, what we saw, particularly during the Bush administration, was the Christian right coming closer and closer and closer to real power, to connections, to real political power. They created groups which Chris has written about, like the Council for National Policy, which involved Christian Reconstructionists, people who believe that Old Testament law needs to be imposed on the United States, up to and including the stoning of incorrigible children and adulteresses and so on. From our own point and kind of monitoring the radical right, from our point of view, I think this kind of peaked in 2003 when the Lawrence versus Texas decision was passed, the Supreme Court ruled that sodomy statutes were not legal. They were not constitutional, in fact, knockdown statutes in 13 states. The rage of the Christian right at that moment, I think, was amazing. I remember writing a piece about how it was far beyond the reaction of the neo-Nazis and the Klan and all of the radical right, who also reacted to the Lawrence decision. At that time, it was very clear that anti-gay violence was far exceeded violence directed against other minority groups, something on the level of 2 to 4 times more per capita attacks directed against gay people, and I think very much driven on by the propaganda of the Christian right. What has happened in the last few years is that we've seen, especially since around 1998-99, the rise of yet another nativist movement, like the ones I briefly mentioned at the beginning. It's really been quite extraordinary. And we saw the first signs of this at a particular meeting in 1998 in which you saw people like California's Barbara Coe, the head of the California Coalition for Immigration Reform, who's a very critical person in the passage of Prop 187 in California back in the 90s, along with other people who were still thought of as relatively mainstream anti-immigration groups, plus Klansmen, plus groups like the Council of Conservative Citizen, which is a white supremacist organization that describes black people as a retrograde species of humanity, quote unquote. So, we saw this kind of unholy mix, so to speak, between nativists and some of the more traditional anti-immigration groups, even including groups like the Federation for American Immigration Reform, and really hardline people on the radical right. This culminated really in the spring of 2005 when the so-called Minuteman Project really got going in Arizona. And people may know that there were a lot of Minuteman groups spawned at that moment. There's something like 300 nativist groups, really nativist vigilante groups out there now, many of them operating on the border, and a great many of them doing things like surveilling day labor center sites and so on. I should say that, all of these groups are very nasty people indeed. However, I think that, if you looked at the Minutemen groups, at some of the larger nativist groups, if those groups were really simply talking to one another in their relatively small, hardcore constituency, I think it would be a lot less of a worry than it is. But the reality is that what we've seen in the last 7 or 8 years is the way that propaganda begins on the radical right, begins in white supremacist hate groups, leaps out into groups like the Minutemen, which are a little less extreme, and before you know it, wind up on CNN, on Lou Dobbs Tonight, on talk radio, and coming from the mouths of politicians like Congressman Tom Tancredo. Just to give you an idea what I'm talking about, I'm sure many people in this room may remember the infamous leprosy claim made by Lou Dobbs. Illegal immigrants had brought to this country in 3 years 7,000 new cases of leprosy. The reality is, as he sort of quickly went to bat against Lou Dobbs on this particular thing, the reality is that the real number of cases was 398, and there was no connection that anyone could prove to immigrants, legal or otherwise. Also, as we showed in this particular case, Dobbs, in fact, and his reporter, Christine Romans, had gotten this from a woman who they described as a respected doctor, who in fact was not a doctor at all. She was a PhD in medieval literature, and her accomplishment in life had been to write a very popular medieval cookbook, which, I don't mean to make light of, but it didn't give her a lot of expertise, in disease and immigration kinds of issues. In fact, it was utterly false. Madeline Cosman used to say things. Matter of fact, I had a reporter at a particular event where she said, all Latino men who come north across the border are coming here to rape little girls, although some specialize in boys and others in nuns. Kind of an interesting idea that one would come north across the border to hunt down nuns. In any event, I think this is really the critical thing, that, there are aiders and abettors to this movement. Dobbs absolutely would not withdraw that claim, which was about as, false as they can get. And it's certainly not only Dobbs, although he makes a convenient sort of target in the sense that he puts so much of this stuff on his air. 1/3 of American prison cells are filled with quote-unquote criminally illegal aliens. And it goes on from there. These things are universally false. And then you have people like Congressman Steve King saying things like, 12 Americans a day are murdered by illegal aliens, and another 13 are run over and killed by drunk illegal alien drivers. When you look at the data, what you realize is that King has completely misinterpreted GAO report, and this isn't even remotely close to the truth. In fact, every study shows, interestingly enough, that immigrants are always less criminal, on average, are less criminal than Americans, and each succeeding generation of immigrants become more criminal as they become more Americanized. So this is just a fantasy. This has consequences, this kind of propaganda. One of the things that we do at the Southern Poverty Law Center, my department, is we count and list and name these groups. And in fact, there has been a growth since the year 2000, when there were 602 groups, to just last year, 2008, this is our brand new count, it's reached 926. That's a 54% increase in the number of groups out there. Our analysis, which I think is essentially indisputable, I guess I would, is that this is entirely due to the exploitation of the illegal immigration issue by these groups. It's been remarkable to see how Klan groups and neo-Nazi groups just quit worrying about, the ills of black people, the ills of yellow people, evil gay people and what they're doing and so on. It was all about illegal aliens all the time, and that's been true, as I say, for 7 years or so now. Another result of that, this kind of propaganda of hate group growth, has been a very marked rise in anti-Latino hate crime, which I would argue is virtually the same thing as anti-quote-unquote illegal alien hate crime. In other words, these attacks on Latinos are almost always directed against people who are thought to be as I say, quote-unquote illegal aliens. The national FBI hate crime stats, which are, have many, many difficulties and weaknesses. Nevertheless, they show what I think is a real trend, which is a 40% rise in anti-Latino hate crimes since 2003. The numbers, when you look at those FBI stats, suggest that there are only 6,000 to 10,000 total hate crimes a year in this country. But everybody in the business has known that number was way low for many years. But I don't think any of us understood how low that was until a very important and very little noticed study came out of the Department of Justice in late 2005, which concluded on the basis of sampling and real serious statistical work as opposed to reports from police departments that the real level of hate crime is not 6,000 to 10,000 cases a year. It's an average of about 191,000 incidents per year involving 210,000 victims per year. And, I think it makes a difference. We're talking about a real social problem here, not a fairly marginal or limited one. The results I think most people have heard about. I mean, I mention only the Marcelo Lucero case, the man who was murdered allegedly by 7 white teenagers who were, big star athletes and so on in Suffolk County in Long Island. The very latest thing we have seen, I'll try and wrap up very quickly, has been this really extraordinary backlash to the Obama first campaign and then actual election. I agree completely with something you said, which is that it really began with the Palin rallies, with the sort of kill him shouts, the terrorist shouts at the Palin rallies, and that seemed to just open up the floodgates. So that in the last few weeks of the campaign, and then certainly for about 3 weeks after Obama was actually elected on November 4th, we saw, I think, a really remarkable and widespread backlash. People had crosses burned on their lawns because they voted for Obama. People were beaten up very badly. We had kids on a school bus in Idaho chanting, "Assassinate Obama, assassinate Obama." These are second and third graders. Where does that come from, if not from their mommies and their daddies? There has been, a church was burned to the ground in Springfield, Massachusetts, and this is sort of mainstream reaction. I'm not talking about hate groups and people involved in the movement I cover. In that world, we saw 2 different alleged plots to assassinate Obama, one particularly half-baked one during the Democratic National Convention in Denver, and then another one by 2 Tennessee skinheads a couple of weeks before the actual election. These men were going to invade a black high school and murder 88 people, and ultimately they were going to shoot Obama and so on. The very latest thing, should anybody think that it has died down, but it's certainly not gone away, is the very day after Obama was inaugurated. What was it, Wednesday, January 21st, a man named Keith Luke stormed out of his house in a Boston suburb, Brockton, Massachusetts. This is a kid who had basically never left his house. His mother later described him as mentally ill from, his teenage years. And what he had spent the last 6 months, as he later told police doing, was reading white supremacist websites. And he had concluded, as he told them, that they were right, that in fact there was a genocide being carried out against white people. The white race was in danger. So once again, it's this idea of the dispossession of whites. And he walked out of that house and he strolled down the street. He barged into one of his neighbors' homes, a black woman, raped her. Her sister broke into the house to try and help the victim of the rape, was shot and killed. He then shot his rape victim as she kind of cowered in the corner holding a teddy bear. He then walked out onto the street and shot the first black man he saw, a 72-year-old homeless man, pushing a grocery cart full of tin cans down the street. And then, followed a huge chase and shootout with the cops, and he was captured. His plan was to go on that night to a very large bingo at an Orthodox synagogue down the way, and, as he said, take as many Jews with him as he possibly could. Kind of goes on from there. Let me say, though, now we are seeing, we've been saying for some time it seemed inevitable that the kind of crashing economy was going to become a centerpiece for the radical right, and that's starting to happen very clearly now. 2 things briefly. There's a conspiracy theory out there which actually originated on a particular AM radio station in Phoenix, which says that 5 million quote-unquote illegal aliens held bad mortgages, subprime mortgages. This was the reason for the subprime collapse, which led to all that has followed, and that's the reason why your dad, brother, mother, sister is losing their job. It's because of these illegal aliens. It's a completely and utterly false report, but that did not stop it from leaping from that AM station right to the Drudge Report, which shot it out into cyberspace, and from there it was a matter of a couple of days before it was on Lou Dobbs Tonight on CNN being presented as fact. The second conspiracy theory that's come out just in the last little while about the economy is that the crash never would have occurred had it not been for the miserable liberals who created the Community Reinvestment Act and forced banks to lend to black and brown people who did not deserve the loans. As it turns out, no surprise, this too is false when you talk to people, the experts who really know about these things. I'll end by saying the very latest iteration of all this has been a series of things said by people on the radical right, by, of all people, Michael Steele, who's, of course, the black man who was just named a few days ago to be the new Republican National Committee chair, the head of the Republican Party. Basically what we've seen from the radical right, and David Duke in particular, is the idea that that is it. Any vestige, any hope of saving white people in any other way than creating a bloody revolution and race war is gone. The Republican Party is completely gone over the edge. There is no hope. There's a magazine, a journal really, that looks like an academic journal called the Occidental Quarterly, which was started by William Regnery, a sort of scion of the publishing family and a very extreme right-winger. The Occidental Quarterly just put out in the last day or two an essay written by their editor, which is headlined with a quote saying, "Prepare to fight to the finish or your kind will vanish." A little further down into his essay, he says, "Our role as nationalists ought to be subversive and revolutionary. There is nothing worth conserving in the current anti-white system." So, that I think is where we're at. And let me say, before I step away, that, I don't mean to suggest with all of this sort of bleak talk, that the election of Obama meant nothing. I think that the election of Obama is a remarkable thing, something that certainly I never thought I would see in my lifetime, and that it gives you some hope that, as King suggested, sort of the arc of history ultimately bends towards justice. I think also it's worth saying that the nativists, the anti-immigration people out there, clearly lost in the elections, as did the evangelicals. So, I think that is really important, and, my own feeling, and I don't pretend to be any kind of real political analyst, I think it's probably more in Chris's line of work, but is that the GOP has marginalized itself and seems to keep going in that direction. Even as we speak. One thing I think is definitely not true is something a colleague of Chris's wrote, Peter Applebaum wrote in a 1997 book called Dixie Rising, about the sort of southernization of American politics. And I think if this election has shown one thing, it's that that's probably not a correct analysis of what's going on. But perhaps I'm just being optimistic. But thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mark. Christopher Hedges is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and veteran war correspondent who is currently a senior fellow at the Nation Institute and has taught at Columbia, New York University, and Princeton University. Chris was part of the New York Times team that won the 2002 Pulitzer Prize for the paper's coverage of global terrorism. In 2002, he received the Amnesty International Global Award for Human Rights Journalism. His recent book, American Fascists, the Christian Right and the War on America, exposes much of the dark alliances we are discussing tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, Chris Hedges.
Thank you very much. I grew up in the church. My father was a Presbyterian minister. My mother was a seminary graduate who was a college professor. I went to divinity school myself at Harvard Divinity School, where I got a Master of Divinity. Although I was not ordained, I completed all the work to be a minister. And during my time at Harvard, I had a great professor of ethics, James Luther Adams, who had been in Germany in 1935 and 1936. Is it on now? Okay. James Luther Adams had been in Germany in 1935 and 1936, working with Martin Niemöller, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Karl Barth, the members of the so-called Confessing Church, the anti-Nazi underground church, those few individuals who defied the Nazis. After a year with them, he was picked up by the Gestapo, interrogated for night. The Gestapo suggested that now might be a good time to return to the United States, which he did. He left on a night train. The contents of his suitcase were covered by framed portraits of Adolf Hitler. When he reached the border patrol opened the suitcase, saw the portraits of the Fuhrer, and closed them up again. Underneath those pictures were rolls of home movie film that Adams had taken, not only of Albert Schweitzer and Barth and Niemöller, but of the so-called German Christian Church, which was pro-Nazi. I watched hours of those films in his apartment in Cambridge as he narrated. He told us as seminarians, this was 1983, that when we were his age, he was then 80 years old, we would all be fighting the Christian fascists. Now, at the time, as brilliant a man as he was, and he was certainly one of the most brilliant professors I ever studied with, it was hard to take such apocalyptic warnings seriously. But Adams understood and saw something in the early 1980s that I think many of us missed. It was, first of all, that fusion between, the fusion of the iconography and language of American Christianity with the iconography and language of nationalism. And he also saw what we are now, of course, experiencing in the economic collapse that we are undergoing, the Weimarization of the American working class. And he understood that those two components had the potential to bring down our democracy, because the engine of all totalitarian movements is despair, personal and economic despair. I left Harvard Divinity School for El Salvador. I spent 5 years there, eventually going on to the Middle East, Africa, the Balkans. Very little time in the United States for almost 20 years. And when I came back, the Christian right, radical Christian right in this country, had moved from the margins and fringes of American society into the very epicenters of power, certainly under the Bush administration, into the executive branch, the judicial branch, and as well into the legislative branch. They had ominously set up parallel systems of indoctrination through Christian radio and television, as well as Christian schools, and had created a hermetically sealed world for tens of millions of Americans who received all of their spiritual guidance, their entertainment, their news, their health and beauty tips through this distorted prism of the Christian right. And it was on my return that I set out to write the book that Ian mentioned, American Fascists, the Christian Right, and the War on America. I did not use the term fascist lightly. It has historical connotations, of course, of black shirts and Nazis, and but I believe that the fundamental components of the ideology of the Christian right, revolving around a series of megachurches throughout the country, can be rightly described as fascist. And one of the last things I did before I completed the book was to sit down for some hours with the two great scholars of fascism, Fritz Stern, who wrote The Politics of Cultural Despair, himself a Jewish refugee, left as a teenager in the 1930s. His entire life's work as a scholar at Columbia was on fascism. And Robert O. Paxton, the great scholar on Vichy, also taught at Columbia, who wrote a book that I would recommend to all of you called The Anatomy of Fascism, where he seeks to deconstruct the fundamental components that go into fascism. Just to touch on a few of those. It is, in all totalitarian movements, there is a hyper-masculinity, the creation of a patriarchal system of power. And you see it shoved on believers in terms of the structure of the family, with the dominant male, the obedient wife, and the subservient children. But this power structure is something that is not limited to the family. It is replicated in the church, it is to be implanted in the community, and then, of course, to the nation at large. There is no questioning of these pastors, invariably male, who are in direct contact with God. I think that there are cult-like qualities to the Christian right. They speak in one voice to the public, not uncommon with radical movements, and another voice to believers. I think one of the most fascinating chapters for me as a reporter was going down to D. James Kennedy, since deceased, his church in Coral Ridge in Fort Lauderdale, and registering through a friend of mine, a classmate of mine who actually did get ordained, to sit in on his evangelism, explosion, conversion seminar, where we were taught how to convert. And it was fascinating in its absolute cold-bloodedness. We were, and I write, in detail about this. The fact that we were instructed to go out and seek out people who had just lost a loved one, recently moved and had no friends, had perhaps just been fired from their jobs and were unemployed. We were all trained how to go to visit a house, always in groups of 3, to carry out something that the great psychiatrist Margaret Singer, who studied cults, called love bombing, where you direct all of your attention and energy towards this person who you know is broken and lonely, and are fascinated. It is forming these faux or these false friendships and drawing them into the community. One of the most interesting things about the Christian right is that it speaks often about family. But the Christian right is the great destroyer of family, because within families, if you as a spouse or a child or a mother or anything else refuse to come into that organization, remember, once you enter these organizations, it consumes all of your time, your educational time, your spiritual time, your recreational time. There's almost something happening all the time at these centers. And some of the big churches, I was at one in Florida run by a guy named Pastor Bob. It is a complex with a bowling alley and dining halls, and that's where you go for your AA meeting, and on and on and on. I mean, it's totally self-contained. So that I would stand at prayer meetings and people would be weeping, sobbing, and asking everyone in the room to pray for unsaved family members, because, of course, it created a division between those who refuse to come into the structure and be subservient to that power system. The Christian right, like all totalitarian movements, and you touched on this, and of course it's a very important point, condemns everything about this world and believes in the capacity of apocalyptic violence as a cleansing agent, as a purifier. I was in Detroit with Tim LaHaye, who wrote, of course, that series, the End Time series. It was a weekend where people were talking about the end times, drawing heavily on the book of Daniel and, of course, the book of Revelation. And there is this, I think that an understandable fear of the world around them. I think it's important to understand, and I did dozens of interviews and began the book by relating many of these stories, that the people who have been drawn into this movement are largely people that have been severely broken by a society that has let them down. And of course, I don't think it's accidental that this particular weekend was held in a very depressed blue-collar neighborhood in Detroit, where you could see the deep physical deterioration of our manufacturing centers and the effects on those people who have been thrust aside like human refuse. It was in story after story that I heard. It was severe financial distress, struggles with addictions, domestic abuse. I mean, one of the most interesting insights for me was attending a pro-life weekend in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. And it was clear, and I think, it's the great, and we were both reporters, and I think you'd probably, or all of us are reporters, and I think you'd concur. I mean, one of the differences between being a reporter and an academic is that when you get out and listen to what people are saying, and often have to listen for a long time, many of the assumptions that you carry into your project or into your reporting are shattered. And this was certainly true in the pro-life movement. I thought naively, I think, that it was somehow about the protection of a fetus or of innocent life. And after hours and hours of this, first of all, one of the first things that happened was they asked all the post-abortive sisters in the room to stand. And it turned out almost every woman in the room stood. Not only that, but it wasn't that they had had one abortion. When I started interviewing them, they had had multiple abortions. And this movement very perniciously and consciously plays on their sense of shame and their guilt. One of the tactics that it uses through funded through a Catholic group called Priests for Life and Rachel's Child, which are converge into it. They take these women away for a weekend, the post-abortive sisters. And when they arrive, they hand them a doll. And they tell them, this is the child you have murdered. And then they tell these women, who remember are very broken, that they must name this doll and clothe it and sleep with it. And on the last night, they have to offer up the child that they have killed to God, to beg for forgiveness, and to make a commitment to spend the rest of their lives fighting the culture of death. That's the phrase that they use, which is us. And what that does and what this movement does is create this severe and stark bifurcation between the culture of life and the culture of death. And the culture of death must not only be vanquished, it must be destroyed. I think that this movement has had ups and downs, like all movements, and if you study any totalitarian movement, including the National Socialist Party, it came perilously close to disappearing, especially after the 23 putsch, the failed putsch. And this movement, too, rises and falls. But the engine of this movement is despair. And the economic collapse that we are undergoing is about to sweep across the landscape, especially of working-class America, and visit a despair unseen in our society since the Great Depression. And there are a couple ominous trends that terrify me about where we are headed. The counterforces against the radical right. And remember, in the 1930s, there was a heavy, again, as you mentioned, heavy flirtation with fascism. Fortune magazine in 1934 put Mussolini on the cover, praising the Italian dictator for restoring stability and empowering industrialists, and of course at the expense of labor unions and labor rights. What we will see is, I believe, through increased suffering on the part, and the suffering is very real. I mean, I think we as a society have very much betrayed the working class, and especially the Democratic Party, which traditionally had watched out for the interests of the working class, abolished under the Clinton administration through NAFTA, welfare reform, etc. The destruction of Glass-Steagall, which got us into the mess we're in now, courtesy of Larry Summers and Robert Rubin. I think that we won't have that counterweight, because in the 30s we had powerful labor unions. We had a strong radical movement. Remember, Eugene Debs had walked away with 1 million votes. We had an independent, non-corporatized press, so that there were actually progressive and even radical publications that, while they may not have been mainstream, were widely disseminated and circulated. Remember, the Catholic Worker, until it came out as a pacifist organization with the advent of World War II, it had up to several 100,000 copies were in circulation. And I think that what I fear is that with the rise of this movement, we will have lost many of the tools by which traditionally we have fought back. Finally, let me end by saying that, like all totalitarian movements, as Hannah Arendt points out in The Origins of Totalitarianism, this is a movement that is based on self-delusion. It is a movement that, because the real world has failed them, these people have migrated to a world of magic and superstition, a world where God intervenes on a daily basis to protect them and guide them and make them prosperous. If you believe in this kind of a world, then it doesn't matter whether you have or don't have health insurance, because with enough faith, God will cure you. And you cannot have a discussion. You can't break these people down rationally. And the rage that they express towards you is the rage of people who are terrified of being pushed back into that world that almost destroyed them. I visited the Creationist Museum in Peterborough, Kentucky, $25 million structure. All of the figures, including the dinosaurs, the animatronic dinosaurs, were built by the people who built the figures at Universal Studios. You walked into the museum, and it has seas of black asphalt parking lots for school buses, for children. And you walk in, and the first exhibit is the Garden of Eden, with Eve and Adam standing in a fake, in front of a fake waterfall. Eve turned in such a way that you, of course, can't see her breasts. And there's a Tyrannosaurus Rex in the Garden of Eden, because, of course, in the Garden of Eden there were no carnivores, the peaceable kingdom, animals. And the guide explained to us that the dinosaurs, by the way, have saddles. And the guide explained to us that the reason T-Rex had such large teeth was because T-Rex was used to open the coconuts. We then moved into a scale model of Noah's Ark, and the question of how did Noah get the dinosaurs on the ark? Well, Noah got the dinosaurs on the ark because Noah only put baby dinosaurs on the ark. I can tell you that in this room, that's funny. In that museum, it was terrifying. No one was laughing. In the entire group, in fact, there was a kind of thrill, because, like all totalitarian movements, what the Christian right has created, and that's, of course, what eugenics was. It was a pseudoscience. They have created creationist science. They have created a pseudoscience to explain myth as scientific fact. And I will end by saying that I think that the only way to blunt what I fear will be a precipitous rise in the power of this movement, which I think is the most dangerous mass movement in American history, is economic. We either reintegrate these people economically into American society, or we lose the democracy and the open society that all of us cherish. Thank you.
So, both of you gentlemen, are we being hysterical Cassandras here? Here we are in a moment of hope and change, and we're just consumed by doom and gloom. And Mark was giving some of the statistics about these far-right groups and how marginal they are, except for the anti-immigrant crowd. So let's get a sense of proportion here. What's your sense of how likely it is? We know that the economy is in free fall, and they're at Washington at the moment. They're literally rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic.
Well, it's not theoretical for me. I covered the war in the former Yugoslavia. And the war in the former Yugoslavia was not caused, as Robert Kaplan wrote, by ancient ethnic hatreds. It was caused by the economic collapse of Yugoslavia, which in the 1980s led to 1,000% inflation, the loss of the loans, which were essentially huge gifts that were given to the communist government under Tito, Yugoslavia was used as a kind of buffer zone by the West through Eastern Europe, the closing of large state-run factories, and the disintegration, the physical disintegration of the society that led to the rise of proto-fascist movements like the Serbian nationalist movement led by Slobodan Milosevic or the Croatian nationalist movement led by Franjo Tuđman. I've watched what that kind of economic chaos does to a society and how people who are thrust into that kind of despair turned to demagogues and charlatans who, of course, explain a mismanagement of their own society, which is, of course, precisely why we are crumbling through mismanagement, on convenient and, of course, largely powerless targets. For me, it's not a matter so much of theory as recognizing so many of the signposts that I've literally watched before.
And Mark, when you gave us the genesis and history of a lot of these movements, and clearly there's, particularly when you look at Oklahoma City, the impression that I get is that there must be some kind of Manichaeanism, the need for an enemy in our society, because the minute the Cold War ended and these very convenient Soviet enemies who really did fit the bill disappeared, it's as though these people took their assault rifles and stomped about in the woods in their camouflage, staring at the sky for black helicopters and checking their backsides for computer chips. And it was like a made-up enemy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely true. I think that it was precisely that, the disappearance of the Soviet Union as the sort of communist boogeyman, the enemy, that, had the radical right and a few million other people in this country focus heavily on the federal government. They became the enemy.
So
and,
now,
of course, that was helped along by the Ronald Reagans of the world, describing the federal government as really the evil out there that needed fighting. I mean, I remember I'll never forget, actually, that right after the Oklahoma City bombing, I remember at the time I was working at USA Today, and we ran a poll which showed, if I remember, something like 47% of Americans felt that the federal government was an immediate threat to their civil liberties, that they were after them. So, after that, the black helicopter stuff, the business about microchips, implanted in your rear end and so on, that was just kind of elaboration of the same thing.
So what concerns you is that there's a real issue out there in terms of paranoia about and misinformation about immigration. So that's how
Not just immigration. One thing I absolutely agree with in your book is the idea that, these movements are founded on lies. They're founded on falsehoods or on the creation of kind of magical worlds. And, I'm not quite as pessimistic as Chris, in the sense that, first of all, I don't think that, a bad economy or even a collapsing economy directly translates into the rise of the radical right. However, the way I think about it is that, when you're in that situation, this is very much what happened in the 80s in this country with the posse comitatus, it creates an opening into which essentially organizers or ideologues can go. So it's not like the steel mill closes and everybody goes and joins the Klan. But the steel mill closes and you've got a situation that is absolutely, wide open, especially in the absence of competing explanations of what's going on to these ideologues. So, what happened with the posse was really family farms were collapsing. They were being sold because of a kind of confluence of events. Under the Carter administration, farmers had been heavily urged to go into agribusiness, bigger and bigger pieces of land. You've got to buy extra acres and so on in order to farm, on an industrial scale. And then all of a sudden came, a giant jump in the interest rates, coupled with the Soviet grain embargo. So they were, all of a sudden being wiped out. And, what happened was it was very much off the front pages of the New York Times and the papers I worked at as well. This was basically an unseen disaster unfolding in the Midwest. And, so there were no activist groups, there were no government groups, there were no academics until the very end going out there to try and talk to people about what was going on. So what really happened was you had these people from the posse going out and explaining that it was the satanic Jew that was behind this all.
Good Lord.
And I'd say one other thing, which is that my own view of how you, I've had an experience over the last year and a half of working with allies, and what I mean in this particular dealing with the nativist movement. I'm talking about groups like La Raza and Mecha and Maldef and so on, kind of immigrant rights groups and Latino rights groups, is that you can do a great deal in terms of combating these groups' lies, and it's quite effective. I don't say that, telling the Christian right that when, James Dobson makes this absolutely false claim that passing a hate crime law federally will mean that they're going to put your pastor in jail for saying, I don't agree with the homosexual lifestyle. Nevertheless, you may not be able to influence that 25% of the population, but, to me, the idea is to inoculate the rest.
And Chris, you started out talking about Germany in the 30s and the few so-called good Germans, the people of conscience, but of course they took an extremely dangerous and lonely path, and the average person adjusted their moral compass to the night and fog, the disappearance of their neighbors. To some extent, I think we as a society are doing that with the Latinos amongst us who are being deported and families are broken up. I mean, is that something that strikes you as a real analogy?
You have a huge segment of the population that is not only virtually invisible to those of us who have full rights, but has not even any of the sort of basic protection of what it means to exist within this country, and yet, of course, are very, used quite perniciously. So I'm always sort of stunned at how, especially as someone who lived in Latin America and has a kind of, fluency with the culture, that how, as you correctly point out, how it's not even it's not mentioned within the society. It's not discussed. It's not, almost all of them who are picked up are deported. I think that the point that Mark makes, by the way, is very true about trying to inoculate the rest of society. I think it is important to recognize that tens of millions of people in this country have been through these parallel information systems severed from society, and you can't reach them. And there are all sorts of interesting examples of that. I mean, Paul and Jan Crouch run Trinity Broadcasting, which is the largest distributor of quote-unquote Christian broadcasting in the world, Sky Angel Satellite, all this kind of stuff. The Los Angeles Times broke a story that he had an affair with his male chauffeur. And it was very well documented, and it did not in any way affect Crouch or his position at Trinity Broadcasting, because he effectively used the levers of communication that he controlled to condemn the secular media. And remember that that great essay by Hofstadter, the Paranoid Politics of American Style, which he correctly points out that these people always accuse the other of doing what they do. So, they say, well, these people have the ideology of secular humanism, this godless secular humanism, and they're using the media and liberal educational institutions and to foist this ideology on the rest of us, and it has very effectively worked. My fear is that, in terms of the Obama administration, is that if the attempts to salvage what is left of our economy through these stimulus package and bailout packages fails, and so far it has not worked, and the country does continue, as you said, to sort of tumble, or go into free fall, that Obama will become a very convenient target, because for large segments of this group, which are primarily white, he really is the other. And I don't know how long the patience will hold out if it doesn't work. As you mentioned at the beginning of this, I think his security is a real issue. I hope that they can get it under control, but there are a lot of reputable economists who think they can't.
Yeah, it's maybe worth saying that, in that context that, David Duke, who's kind of the closest thing the radical right has to an intellectual these days, although he ain't much.
Well,
David
Rush
Duke
Limbaugh,
said
yeah.
back in July that, well, it's looking bad. It looks like Obama might win. However, he certainly didn't urge people to vote for Obama, but what he said was that if Obama wins, it will be a, quote, visual aid to white America. And that is how, that's the danger. Right? It plays right into what you're saying, this idea that when things are bad, there he is.
But the people that I'm more afraid of are the suits behind the guys in robes. The Limbaughs, the more articulate and intelligent ones, not the crackers.
That's a bit of a stretch in describing Limbaugh, but
Well,
I have a different view. I think that Limbaugh is less and less effective. I think he was such an absolute shill for every aspect of the Bush administration that he's a little bit marginalized now. I understand he got a lot of press out of Obama saying something about him. We don't need to listen to the Limbaughs of the world. But in general, I think I'm making the same argument that, it is the people, it's the enablers. There might be 200,000 people directly involved in hate groups in America. We're a country of 300 plus million. That's not a large percentage. But, I talk a lot about the immigration debate because I think it's such an obvious case, of a discourse that should happen in a democratic society, but which in ours has been utterly poisoned by really a very small group of people aided and abetted by politicians and pundits and, in many cases, pastors.
well, let's take calls here. Not calls. We're not on the radio. Questions from the audience. We have two microphones that are traveling down the corridor here, right next to you there.
Good evening. Thank you very much. My name is Dr. Kenya Davis Hayes, and I actually work at a Christian university. And so I was just curious to know how you delineate sort of the radical Christian right with sort of a broader, more mainstream Christian community, because I've been sitting here and I do work at an evangelical university. We do teach science, and we don't
Right.
believe in Tyrannosaurus rexes with saddles or anything like that, which I'm really distressed by. So I'm just trying to figure out how you would define that.
Well, as you know, and I point out in the book, especially among the evangelical movement, there is a wide variety of theological viewpoints, which has been traditional among evangelical movements. Evangelism accepts, in a way that Christian fundamentalists do not, many ways to come to Christ. And I, in fact, think that the most potent opposition to the radical Christian right will probably come out of the evangelical movement, rather than the liberal church, which is pretty much a spent force. That's another evening's discussion. The distinction that I would make is the division between those who believe that they have been anointed to create a Christian nation and those who do not. And that's a new movement. It began with Rousas Rushdoony in 1973 with his book, The Institutes of Biblical Law, which is really the foundational document for the so-called Christian dominionists or Christian reconstructionists. Those people which was a kind of heresy within both fundamentalism and evangelical religion, believe that rather than wait for Christ to return and create the kingdom of God, they would build the kingdom of God in the United States, and then Christ would return. It came out of Darby, and you know all this. So that movement itself was something that we had not seen, and there was a conscious effort on the part of people like Tim LaHaye to build alliances with very powerful right-wing business interests that would fund this movement. So that kind of naked attempt to achieve political power is something that we have never seen in American history. And all the religious revivals that America has experienced going back to the Great Awakening of 1740. This is the first revivalist movement that we have seen that has as its goal the assumption of political power. And I think it's important, and here Victor Klemperer's great diaries, I Shall Bear Witness, I mean, they're fascinating to read because it's the first literary critique of the language of national socialism in Germany. He was a professor of literature and linguistics in Leipzig and lost his job, of course, but set about looking at language within his diary. And I think that one of the most pernicious aspects of this movement, and I'm talking about the hardline dominionists, is they speak in the comforting language of traditional evangelicalism or traditional Christianity and Christian patriotism. But like the National Socialists, they have hollowed out words to make them mean something completely different. So that when, and Bush would do this all the time, he would use code words courtesy of his evangelical speechwriters. He would use the word liberty, that finally we can achieve liberty. Well, within this movement, liberty doesn't mean a sense of freedom or free expression. Liberty means the final liberty that comes with complete and total submission to Jesus Christ. So they use comforting and reassuring words, but among the initiated or the anointed, these words mean something very, very different.
If I might add something to this, I just want to say that, something worth understanding about the Rushdunis of the world, is there is a white nationalist element to this. I mean, many of the people from that theological background before Rushduni were very opposed to sort of meddling in political affairs, right? I mean, this was a spiritual journey. You didn't mess with the temporal world. That was not something that people ought to worry about. But, then came the civil rights movement, and, little remembered now, although remembered in your book, among other places, the Jerry Falwells of the world were busy denouncing the civil rights movement. Now that's been kind of whited out of their history, but the reality is that in part is what drove this theology,
That's
right? I mean, we've got to get temporal. Our world is being taken from us. So, these things are kind of hidden, but, behind what's happening, there's a great deal of opposition to people who are not white.
And Falwell for 10 years, I mean, you're right that he built his movement on this, on defined segregation, and built his empire in Lynchburg. And then when that kind of raw racism became unpalatable within mainstream society, he went back and tracked down every sermon that he preached over a 10-year. We only have one sermon that Falwell preached over a 10-year period, because it is precisely as you point out about white supremacy.
On this side, this gentleman here with his hand up on your right.
Thank you. I just wanted to, in referencing Ian's statement or metaphor about the men in suits behind the robes, two quick questions to Chris. First, why is there not any kind of sober scrutiny on the political philosophy behind neoconservatism, which essentially sees religion as a necessary opiate for the masses for the purposes of political mobilization, for war or otherwise? And secondly, you had mentioned at the podium that we need to start economically reintegrating these supposed people on the fringes. And I ask, especially in light of, this economic depression that's exacerbating by the week, how are we able to do that when not just the fringes, but really the totality of our populace are more or less beholden to a banking class that's in turn beholden to really nobody but themselves? Thank you.
Well, that's why I'm so frightened, because Obama has bought into this paradigm that, bailing out AIG to save Goldman Sachs is somehow good for America. The reason these investment firms and banks aren't lending this money is because it's all gone to pay off these huge insurance policies that were largely propagated by companies like AIG on collected mortgages that they knew were going to go bad. I mean, it's all of this money is in essence being thrown into a furnace and burned. And what happens when you start printing a lot of money? Well, look at Yugoslavia. They did it, or go back to Weimar Germany. So you have huge segments of the society, and I wouldn't even say that they're fringes. I would say, largely the working class has been completely decimated through outsourcing and globalization. And what globalization does, in essence, is reduce all of us, and not only in the working class, but increasingly in the white-collar sectors, to subsistence level, to make us somehow competitive in a global economic environment. The sustenance of an open society, as Karl Popper and many others understood, was a stable middle class. Destroy that, and it's very hard. Look, go back all the way to Plutarch, who wrote that it was impossible to sustain a democracy with an oligarchy, and we have created an oligarchic system. I think that when you look at the economic and political restructuring of American society and the empowerment of a very narrow political and economic elite, we are, and now, of course, with the consequences of that, rapacious and horrible mismanagement of the country's economic system, many of these trends are going to be accelerated. In terms of the opiate, the idea that religion is an opiate, well, the capitalist class or the corporate class in this country understands, and Leo Strauss wrote about it. Many of these people are Straussians. Religion is a myth, religion is a lie, however, and the enlightened person, of course he picks all this up from Plato, the enlightened person must recognize the fallacy of religion, but don't publicly challenge religion because it is useful in terms of keeping social control. And that's why you see companies like Walmart, Sam's Club, bring in evangelical pastors of this particular stripe to proselytize to their workforce, because this kind of religion is an opiate. It is about having enough faith in order to receive the guiding hand of Jesus Christ.
On this side? Down here in front.
Chris, you mentioned that with a bad economy, this will just sort of accelerate. But this attitude also existed when we had a robust economy. So in an ideal world, where would you see this sort of unwinding, or how would this improve in an ideal world for you?
We had a robust economy that was a giant Ponzi scheme. It was a robust economy if you believed Robert Rubin and Bernie Madoff. It wasn't robust. It was a scam. And this movement took off with NAFTA. This movement, maybe before, but certainly accelerated when manufacturing centers. I don't think it's accidental that the epicenters of this movement come from two places. Former manufacturing centers, places like Youngstown, the Rust Belt, and also, interestingly enough, these huge exurbs like Orange County, which are not economically as deprived, but through development have essentially destroyed the capacity for community. Because that's what the danger, that's what and Hannah Arendt calls it atomization, that disconnectedness, that physical destruction of community, and poverty, of course, physically destroys community, and developers physically destroy community. So that you have whole areas, and I made 2 or 3 trips to Orange County, and I'm not picking on Orange County. There are many places around the country that have this similar layout, where there's often no sidewalks, there's no community center. People commute, long commutes in their car alone. They go to rather soulless offices, of course, wondering when they're going to get axed in terms of a job and go back. And that's why when I say that this movement, like all totalitarian movement, preys on despair, it preys on personal and economic despair. I think it is usually primarily economic, but not exclusively.
And not to beat a dead horse, while they're trapped in their cars, they're often listening to Rush Limbaugh.
There has been a fusion between the radical Jewish right and the Christian right, and there's a commonality of belief. They are both messianic movements. I use the word messianic with a small m, in that they believe that they have been either given the moral or the divine right to dominate the lives primarily of Palestinians, but of basically Muslims in the Muslim world. And there is and you use the word fascism. You know, in the 1950s, there was an event in New York attended by Hannah Arendt and Albert Einstein in which they both denounced these radical Jewish troops, the Stern Gang and Ergun, as fascist. And there's been a strain of that. We ended up with the head of the Stern Gang. Begin was a prime minister. Livni's father was the operations officer for the Ergun, which set off a bomb in the King David Hotel, which killed 94 people, or 92 people, including 4 Jews. They captured 2 British sergeants, hung them, booby-trapped their bodies, and then, of course, went in with the Ergun and Stern into Deir Yassin and murdered 247 Palestinians. So, I write a lot about Hamas, and I spent a lot of time in Gaza. So I spent 7 years in the Middle East. What's the moral difference between Hamas and Ergun? Nothing. And that strain has been very powerful in Israeli society. It's real. I covered Rabin, who I knew. I think that that strong element of ethnic cleansing in Israel was something that Rabin realized was self-destructive to Israel. Israel can't pick itself up off the map and move somewhere else. It is where it is. And Rabin had a kind of vision that, unfortunately, with his assassination, has not been picked up and carried by anyone else within the Israeli leadership. And I think that when we look at Gaza, the recent thing in Gaza, there's a method to this kind of madness, and it comes very much out of this ideology, which is about crushing the Palestinians and essentially driving them. But you're right, it's certainly there. But you know what? Robert Paxton points out that it's in every society, and I think he's right. I mean, Paxton in his book calls the most authentically fascist movement in American society the Ku Klux Klan. He said, no matter what, how stable a society is or how open, all these groups always exist in every society, and they exist in our society, they exist in Israel, and they exist everywhere else.
And the vast majority of Jewish Americans are secular and liberal. So I don't think your overall thesis is necessarily correct.
Yeah, within American society, I don't see, and don't forget that the racism and the anti-Semitism within this movement is very real. You can take figures like LaHaye's personal background, and it goes back to the John Birch Society and the World Anti-Communist League, right back to the Klan. And remember, every chapter of the Ku Klux Klan had a chaplain. There is a direct line from the Klan to these people.
I mean, the thing that hasn't been said is that, of course, the movement you're talking about is Christian Zionism. And, the irony, naturally, is that, these are people who sidle up, better than I, right, to the Ariel Sharons of the world in a big way, and at times when Israel is, extremely isolated, like as the invasion of Gaza, during the period of the invasion of Gaza, that's when you see, the hardcore support of the Israeli right comes from the Christian Zionists. What's not said by sort of the Jewish recipients of this, adoration or of this "I want to be your friend and ally," is what the theology of it is, which is that the reason that there are Christian Zionists is because the Jews have to gather in Israel, in order for Christ to return, and most of them will be killed, they'll be slaughtered because, of course, they won't accept Christ. So it's an unbelievable alliance.
144,000 get a free pass.
That's not a lot.
Otherwise, they all go into the lake of fire like the rest of us. So in order for their world to begin, our world has to end in burning flesh. It's quite a psychotic belief system. Anybody over on this side? This lady right next to you on your right.
Yeah, you've mentioned Rush Limbaugh a couple of times, that he's marginalized and people are listening to him on the radio. I come from Oregon where, and I think much of the United States, Rush and people like him are the only ones on the radio. There was an Air America for a while in Eugene, Oregon, that was taken off. So I'm just wondering, with the economic downturn, I feel like more people sitting at home without jobs, he's going to become more and more influential.
Chris, you think we'll have a new Father Coughlin here?
Yeah, because, and you're right, that because corporate sponsors like these people, and they make money for them. It's why O'Reilly makes, what, $4 million a year, is it? That gets into a whole other issue of the rise of the corporate state and what that means. And fascism, of course, is twinned with the idea of corporatism, or the creation of corporatism. The natural extension of the corporate state is the surveillance state. And I think that our democracy is very anemic because our government has been completely hijacked by corporate interests. We all get to vote, but it doesn't really make any difference, because when legislators get to Washington or state capitals, they are beholden to the people who paid for their capacity to be candidates. I'm one of, with Naomi Klein and a couple others, we're suing the federal government. I'm part of the ACLU lawsuit on the FISA Reform Act. The FISA Reform Act is a giant step towards fascism, and Obama knows it, and he voted for it. And after promising to filibuster against it, and he voted for it because telecommunication companies, there were 30 lawsuits working their way up through the court system against these telecommunication companies, where we now know essentially turning over tens of millions of records of Americans over to the government. They're all stored, by the way, and they can all be shared with other governments. Pumped 15 to 20 million in lobbying fees, and we saw it again with the bailout. Constituent calls were running 100 to 1 against the first passage of the $750 billion bailout. Across the political spectrum, some of the most impassioned speeches against the bailout in the House came from Republicans from Texas, and it passed. Why did it pass? Because the corporate state wanted it passed. And however inefficient and broken our government may be, it is the only institution we have as citizens to safeguard and protect our interests. When that instrument is taken from us, when it becomes an instrument in the service of corporations, then we undergo what we have been undergoing, which is a coup d'etat in slow motion.
Gentlemen, you just passed there on. Oh, what? Oh, your mic's gone? So can you shout out up there? Oh, no, you've got one. You've got one. It's right next to you.
Thank you. Just two quick observations. I've been a long-time supporter and fan of the Southern Poverty Law Center, particularly Morris Dees. And it's one of the 4 institutions that did not get my financial donations in the 8 years that Bush was in office. That could be a statistical accident, but I don't know. I'd like the panel to respond to just 2 questions, if they could give me their impressions about the interesting voter turnout on Prop 8 in California, particularly the support by minorities for Prop 8, and also what you would think would be the appreciable difference between good Americans who have done nothing to end the wars that we have currently in aggression, and bad Germans in the 30s and 40s.
Good questions. Chris? You're both stunned.
No, I agree with you. It's why I voted for Ralph Nader, who did not lose the 2000 election. It was stolen from us, as Gore now publicly says. I I suppose part of that is personal in a sense that having spent so much of my life in Iraq and having lost both Iraqis and foreign correspondents in this conflict, because I was a war correspondent and war is not an abstraction, I understand the instrument of war. Because I was such a vocal opponent, indeed lost my job at the New York Times because of that, denouncing the war and the build-up to the war. I can't vote for any candidate who doesn't, who in essence codifies what under post-Nuremberg laws is defined as a criminal war of aggression, which is the war in Iraq and Afghanistan are. We have no legal or moral right to be there. And my fear is that the legacy of the Bush administration may be the codification of our status as a rogue nation. And that was not debated. We have no right under international law to debate the terms of the occupation. Preemptive war is illegal. And so I share your frustration over the fact that we as a populace have become complacent and passive about this gross abuse of imperial power, which, by the way, is deeply counterproductive, aside from its moral and legal issues, deeply counterproductive to our long-term interests in the Middle East.
And Mark, what about the minorities voting for Proposition 8? That part of the question.
Well, I mean, I think the reality is it's not much said. I'm not sure, is this really working?
Put it right in front like that.
I think the reality is, which is not much spoken about publicly, is that the black church, large sections of the black church, are deeply and virulently homophobic. I mean, I just think it's undeniable. And, that, I think, is what was really going on out in California in terms of the black votes on Proposition 8. So, I mean, that's pretty much what I would have to say about that. I think that's really what occurred. I think, let me say something that's a little bit off of the question that Chris answered. In my own, I think government is extremely important, and I don't disagree with the thing you said. At the same time, I think that over the last 25 or 30 years, the left fiddled while Rome burned. What I mean by that is while, not to attack anybody local, but, while the sort of Berkeley City Council is debating whether to change the names of manholes to person holes, the right is busy building extra-governmental institutions, which are incredibly important. So, for instance, the nativist movement was not simply created by Chris Simcox and a few, lunatic vigilantes down on the Arizona border, right? I mean, it's created and backed up by a set of institutions, some of which are foundations, by a set of funding mechanisms that have got to be countered. I can tell that I'm a little more optimistic than Chris is in general, and I would say, in that optimistic vein that, my own sense is that, in fact, we've seen the small beginnings of a sort of counter media forming. I mean, I think it really began with Jon Stewart and The Daily Show, which kind of morphed into The Colbert Show, and now we have MSNBC. I'm not saying these are, fabulous, super progressive outfits, but I mean, to me, a Rachel Maddow on even cable television 5 years ago was almost unimaginable. So, what I'm saying is get active, do something. You cannot simply, beat your breast about the government being corporatized and so on, although, as I say, I don't disagree with that. But, people need to get out there and build institutions and fight back, because otherwise your country will be taken from you.
This might be the last question, I think. And this lady here in the middle, did you have a hand up? Okay. Well,
Which is,
you have a complicated one?
my simple question is, in the context of the evangelical movement, who is Rick Warren and how is he seen within the evangelical movement? And particularly, I would say, the most extreme end of it.
Rick Warren is Dobson with a smiley face. Rick Warren is a scary guy. Rick Warren, through the purpose-driven life and the prosperity gospel, is up to his neck in this stuff. One of the things Dr. Adams told us as students was, as a kind of canary in the cage, to watch what we did as a society to homosexuals, because they're a powerless, relatively powerless, and easily marginalized group, as they were in Germany. And the first decree, one of the first decrees that Hitler passed in January of 1933 when he became chancellor, was banning all homosexual meeting places. And the first major book burning in Nazi Germany took place in May of 1933 when they burned the library of the Institute for Sexual Science, Hirschfield's. Of course, and so is the Christian right, because, yeah, Hitler, and there's some, biographies like Kershaw and others even speculate that Hitler had a gay relationship when he was in the boarding house in Vienna. Hitler's own sexuality has often come into question. Not only was homosexual activity rampant within the Nazi leadership, just as it is within the Christian right. Ted Haggard is not the only closeted gay in the movement. The greatest homophobes often gravitate to these positions. But large numbers of the Nazi movement had Jewish blood, including, we speculate, including perhaps Hitler himself. Hitler's grandmother worked as a maid in a Jewish household, and she became pregnant. And there was no father listed, but the household paid paternity money to her. Presumably the son got her pregnant, until Hitler's father was 16. And there was even an attempt by a rather foolish cousin on the part of Hitler early in the movement to blackmail him over this issue. You can imagine what happened to him. But one of the things that's important to remember about this movement is that it is riven with precisely the sins that it condemns. And I think that is because, like all totalitarian movements, it externalizes evil. It doesn't understand what the great moral philosophers, Primo Levi, on down, have written, that the most dangerous evil is the evil within us. And when we believe that evil is something outside of us, usually embodied in human form, and that once we remove that evil, we will somehow purify the world, we begin to carry out acts of barbarity and criminality in the name of highest virtue. Every genocide that I ever covered was carried out by idealists. And I think the strange pathology of the Christian right fits this very dark totalitarian vision.
Well, gentlemen, I thank you. Do you have a last word, Mark? Thank you so much for coming, and I thank you all for joining us. And